I'd like to turn to Fahd Ahmed now. He's the longtime executive director of DRUM, a CCF coalition partner. Fahd, first, I'd like to, I mean, we can talk about your experience with some of these cases maybe in a minute, but I just want to get your reaction to a couple of quotes, one from this Stash House sting appeal that I mentioned, and also one from the Newberg case. And these convictions were not reversed. The sentences were not reduced, at least not yet. In United States v. Conley, the Seventh Circuit court, where the defense had argued that the case should be dismissed for outrageous governmental conduct and racial discrimination, the court said these stings are troubling in several ways. First, the agents in these stings blindly encouraged the initial target to rope in a large group of co-conspirators who otherwise may have stayed out of trouble. Second, the vast majority of defendants caught in these stings have been poor people of color. Third, these stings give law enforcement free rein to manipulate sentences by setting imaginary drug amounts. But that wasn't enough to reverse the conviction. And then in the Newberg case, the judge said, it is beyond question that the government created the crime here. The government dangled what had to be an almost irresistible temptation in front of an impoverished man from what I have come to view as the saddest and most dysfunctional community in the Southern District of New York. From the perspective of the citizens of Newberg, who are frequently targeted by various government operations, I can well understand why the FBI's conduct is seen as both outrageous and incomprehensible. But she didn't reverse the convictions, and she didn't go below the mandatory minimum. Hopefully she will now with our compassionate release motions. But can I get your reaction to that and kind of generally what we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think, you know, Erica made this point around like sort of a reference to just because something is a law or the operation of law doesn't mean that it's just. And I think, you know, the problem that we have is that these things keep repeating themselves. One, because most often, if any court or, you know, like policymakers do find some fault in this, they really see it as like an isolated incident. If you're really lucky, you get like some of these class action lawsuits, like, all right, like there seems to be a little bit of a pattern going on here. But the reality is that, like, you know, like there's actually like a historical continuity of these sorts of things across American history, right? And the reason that like we keep seeing these patterns over and over is because we don't acknowledge sort of like the full history and the full patterns of it. You know, we see the use of this kind of surveillance. Well, we see the use of surveillance, infiltration, and sowing of dissension from like even before the founding of the US, right? In the encounters with indigenous peoples and sort of like how divide and conquer was used. We see it in, you know, there's lots of documentation of amongst enslaved peoples, sort of like how certain people were picked to sort of spy and report things back. And then like we sort of see a more formalization of this with the Red Squads and then the targeting of organized crime. But it's really, and Mike German may know this a little bit better, but you know, at that point it was largely infiltration and surveillance, but it's really with COINTELPRO in the 60s and 70s, where it was the FBI's program to target anti-war activists, to target Black activists, that it moved from just surveillance and infiltration to actual like trying to agitate people to commit crimes. Because it was, you've already criminalized somebody in thought, and then you enact like sort of how do we bend the rules to like sort of like make this come to fruition. And that's really the continuity like coming out of COINTELPRO that we see then in the war on drugs cases and that we now see in the war on terror cases. And so, you know, like I think it is good when we see these instances where the judges pick something up. Most of the time their hands are tied to really actually be able to do anything from it. But even in the few instances that they do something, it just pops up again because we haven't really like sort of like talked about this as a whole trajectory and a whole pattern that's very much enmeshed in the fabric of American history and tied to notions of what communities are included, what communities are not, who's worthy, who's not, who's worthy of being considered to have been given a second chance or have alternative considerations, and who's not, who's just automatically presumed guilty. And so, I think it's we take what we can when we get it from the courts, but we also have to continue to dig deeper.
Yeah, and we in CCF, we look at the concept of sort of like what you were talking about, preemptive prosecution, where they are looking at, okay, these people are Muslim who have and are critical of US foreign policy, and therefore they're suspicious, and therefore we're going to target them. And they're not committing any crimes, but we're going to either get them on immigration violations, try to get them to be informants, or we're going to target them in a sting operation, or we're going to get them on some kind of material support charge. We're going to get them one way or the other. We're not going to just let them go off on their own, because there's a slight chance that someday they might become radicalized or become engage in some act of violence against the United States. And so we're going to go after them beforehand. And we don't care how many lives we destroy in the process. Or like with the stash house sting cases, we're going to target these people who maybe have no money and dangle all this money in front of them. And, of course, lots of people are going to go for something like that. So it's a matter of who you target. You could target like different groups of people and get the same result. Maybe you change the tactics, but that just shows how incredibly discriminatory and abusive it is.
Yeah. I think one thing I would add, though, is that there are patterns in terms of who they target, right? If you look at like Red Squads or COINTELPRO, like it's when movements are rising up to challenge the government and challenge society around the ways that like it is discriminatory or the injustices that exist. The war on drugs very much parallels sort of like economic changes in the US, as like we see deindustrialization, we see white flight, we see these concentrations of like largely Black communities in the inner cities, and the war on drugs becomes a way to deal with these folks that have been deprived of jobs, and it is, if not lucrative, then like sort of like socially easier to incarcerate them. And then with the war on terror, it is very much tied to the wars abroad, right? It's not a coincidence that the communities that are being targeted domestically are very much the same or similar communities that our government is also waged and engaged in wars with abroad. And so a lot of this targeting and like in many of these cases, like we see it like very clearly, like when the NYPD in New York, like sort of like had its first handful of cases of like where, informants or undercovers were used, arrested. Immediately after those cases, they would come and be like, this is why we need more funding, right? So it comes around funding for like law enforcement. And then we see on the national level that politicians would pick up these cases, small, sometimes local cases, and be like, look, this is why we're fighting for our freedoms in Afghanistan and Iraq or like whatever, to try to justify and legitimize the wars that are ongoing. And so like there is like cyclical kind of pattern there in terms of like how it feeds itself.
I certainly agree with that. And so can you, and we'll open up this to others too, but can you give us some thoughts about the best way to fight against this stuff, as you've been doing with Drum for a really long time? And then we'll hear from other people on that too.
So because these are very complicated, like multi-layered issues, right? Like if we think about like sort of a tie-in to wars abroad, to like large funding for local and federal law enforcement, to the impact on communities, to the impact on individuals, we do need like multiple strategies to be able to address it, right? We need people that are doing policy-based work. We need people that are doing legal work. Well, one of the things I think we found is that there is something that can be done from the on the very grassroots level, from like the individual cases, which we found is you know, if we bring up a case of like, oh, this person was targeted by an informant and is now serving 30 years in prison, and you know, you could present all the evidence and all the glaring things in the case, but like people's fear factor remains, right? Like people's fear factor that's kind of been drilled into them, like very easily kicks in. They're like, yeah, it doesn't sound right, but I don't know, I'd rather be safe. And like, sure, like some people's rights will be lost, but like that's how the world is, right?
It kind
But
of flips the burden of proof on its head, like, yeah.
Yeah, but what helps is that like, if we, you know, like because we've been working locally in the community, we can actually talk about like sort of like all the increasing steps of the surveillance apparatus, like just the quiet surveillance of mosques. When the NYPD's reports were leaked from the Associated Press in 2011, that they had a list of like the 200 plus mosques in New York City, where they knew who the imam was, who the congregation was, what were the political leanings, what forces were they connected to back home. You know, like that's kind of like the lowest level. Then you see the medium level where like some people are being asked to become informants. Somebody gets caught up in a small minor drug case, and then either that young person or that person's father, who's on the board of a masjid, has said like, we'll drop his case if you become a spy for us. When you put those two levels, then the third level, which is where like somebody's actually been actively entrapped, like that starts to make more sense. Oh, okay, so the informants are quietly spying, the informants are agitating people or like trying to recruit people, and then when they're not succeeding, then they're like proactively like trying to incite people. And that's kind of like in 2011, once we started fighting back against like the leaks that came out around the NYPD reports. The reports didn't tell us anything new. We already knew all of these things, but it became evidence for us to say like, look, here's the whole spectrum of the surveillance apparatus. And so now when we talk about the most egregious cases, you can see sort of like how it's in increasing levels of like all the previous levels. And then it really started to click. It started to click with like other people that were engaged in social movements that have also both historically been targeted and continue to be targeted. And then even just in communities, like it started to resonate. And so that allowed us to like sort of build coalitions where people were saying like, look, this is not right. And, you know, I think it's been, in terms of systematically, I think like sort of like the rollback of the NYPD surveillance apparatus is like one of the kind of outstanding kind of examples. It's not to say that they've stopped. They've largely combined their operations in with the FBI through like the Joint Terrorism Task Force, but like sort of like their own operations that they were doing have been severely reduced. I don't think we've seen an NYPD only case in like more than like 6 or 7 years. And, you know, I think these stories and then like working with those families becomes the way to like actually go out and like talk to their communities. And, you know, like it's really like those families that particularly CCF and organizations like DRUM have like supported, developed their leadership to go tell their stories, to go to churches, to go to community centers, to go talk to media, that it actually starts to spread that like, look, these are real human beings, these are families, these are communities, here are the impacts. And you know, like sort of like, I think like maybe Mike hinted at it, and then Beverly as well, like sort of like the devastation that the families endure. I mean, there are families whose own families stopped talking to them because they have now been so stigmatized. The families are like, if I talk to my sister, like maybe the FBI will come after me. And you know, like we work with like several of these families where like people have been completely cut off, not only from their communities, not only from society, but even from their own families, their own blood. And like the devastation of like sort of having a loved one locked away. For every one of these families, every day that their loved one is in prison, the families on the outside are serving every day of that sentence with them. Every single day. Every phone call they get is just a reminder that they are collectively suffering.